Because don't forget, this particular individual did engage and did go through some assessments and fully engage with child adolescent mental health services at one point. The fact that he withdrew, and this is the thing, we're giving listeners the idea that there is a magic bullet to stop violent offenders, and we will never make it 100% safe.
Welcome, Neil Basu. Thank you for joining us. Let me ask you first of all, Neil. I mean, you've thought about this, I know. Looking at the Southport murders through your eyes, the eyes of a former police commander, might that have been avoided?
Well, the most important thing to say is this has been the beginning of another incredibly grueling week for the families, for the bereaved, and for everyone in the Southport community, and they'll be looking for answers from the reviews that have been commissioned. So the first thing I would say is the reviews are a great thing. It was right to announce them. The Prime Minister was right to say this was a nationally defining crime. And we only ever get better after tragedies. It's a terrible thing for bereaved to hear, but my professional experiences, inquests, public inquiries, trials, are where families at least get to understand what's happened. I mean, they've got a life sentence. I don't necessarily think it brings closure, but it does help. And if we can stop this ever happening again, that would be a good thing. Could it have been avoided? There's been a lot of speculation on that, which will have to wait for the review, because we know so many agencies touched this man's life. And of course, when he was a very young boy, he would have looked very different from what we can now see as a monster and a serial killer with hindsight. So we'd have to be very clear about each decision that was made, how decisions were made cumulatively, how much information was passed between agencies. But I said it last week, I can write the last line of this review. It will be agencies didn't speak to each other, they didn't share, and the decisions were made by inexperienced people who were overwhelmed on the front line.
Yes.
It's the same final line of every major serious crime review I've ever seen in my 30 years of policing.
Yes. I mean, a lot of people would agree with that. But again, it does, I suppose, beg the ultimate question, which I do want to cover. Even had Axel Rudakubana been more clearly spotted by different agencies who did speak, who would have spoken to each other, more effectively than they did, how do you stop a crime being committed before it is committed? Simply by identifying someone of interest, of concern?
Well, that's the basic premise of the counter-terrorism machine we have in this country. So you have a government, a UK intelligence community led by MI5 for domestic threat, and counter-terrorism policing looking to stop terrorists doing that by proactively intervening before they can mobilize to commit the actual crime. Now, that involves a great deal of intelligence gathering and pretty much a great deal of technical and physical surveillance, and then early intervention, because we have very strong terrorism laws that allow us to do that. In normal crime, and there is no evidence this was terrorism, or no evidence has been found, he would have to confess. There'd have to be something found in his streaming. They've done a great investigation into that and have not found it. So this monster doesn't seem to have an ideology, doesn't therefore fit terrorism, therefore using terrorist laws to intervene early would not have led to a charge. It might have had him in for a few days questioning, but it wouldn't have actually led to a charge if they had intervened before he had, started mobilizing towards an act. So the short answer to your question is, unless there is the intelligence to put somebody under permanent surveillance, or the assessment that they have such severe mental health difficulties they need to be sectioned, there is a gap. There is a gap here.
Right, exactly. And it's not remotely clear if an answer to that exists. If you've got someone who you suspect may be about to commit a horrendous crime like this, as you say, Neil, then, well, there's one course of action, which is to put them under permanent surveillance. But of course, as I understand it, you will know vastly better than me, permanent surveillance by the police is a hugely labor-intensive 24-hour operation. I've heard it said you need 50 officers. It's just not a practical idea.
No, in my day that we had, it was well known because Ben Wallace, who was security minister at the time, told everyone, bless him, that we had 3,000 active subjects under investigation in the terrorism space. There are 7,000 people referred to prevent every year, of which, at least 40% of them will be either potentially Islamist radicalized people or potentially extreme right-wing radicalized, but 6,000 to 7,000 per year. All of those have to be triaged and assessed as to which are the most dangerous, the most likely to cause harm,
Yes.
to put very limited resources on. And what you've just described is not grossly inaccurate. I
Mm.
mean, I can't tell you how many people we could do that for, but I
Yes.
think your taxes would probably have to double.
Yeah. Well, indeed, just simply not practical, not politically, not
So we
otherwise.
have to get the answer is getting the assessment right in the first place. And that is
Yeah.
the criticism here in Southport. And we'll have to wait for the review to understand how those assessments were made. But there is
Mm.
a decision-making framework, that is built by criminal psychologists, was called the Vulnerability Assessment Framework.
Yes.
That has been updated and improved. There is an issue about he was referred 3 times. Well, there's an issue about repetitive referral. So
Yes.
you shouldn't treat each referral as an isolated case. You should
Yes.
accumulate and be more professionally curious about the fact that there are repeat referrals. And of course, there were many other agencies, which is why I say, was everyone talking to each other over
Yes.
that 3 to 4 year period? Now, Channel, so this is the argument, he should have been put into Channel. Somebody made a decision that he didn't meet that threshold. So we'll need to look at
Channel. Forgive me, Neil. Channel.
Channel is the government's program for people who pass the prevent assessment, and there is a vulnerability to radicalization, and we think they could eventually one day become a terrorist.
Yeah.
They volunteer to go into a program which is effectively full of professionals who will help them both with the socioeconomic circumstances of their life, whether
Yes.
that's training, education, housing, mental health, but also with intervention providers who will try and talk them down from their ideology, because
Right.
they're generally speaking they're having violent thoughts about committing violence in order to pursue an ideology or a cause, as opposed to a violent person looking for an ideology as an excuse to commit violence. They're very
Right.
different things. One is
Indeed.
terrorism, one is not.
Right. So that would require Axel Rudakubana or some other person in the future to be identified as a potential lethal threat. And for that person, then having been approached by the authorities through whatever agency to agree that, yes, they are that threat and they want to be helped with it. They want to take guidance and counseling and taken to another place. Now,
Yes.
of course, that can be attempted, but you need the person involved to want that to happen.
Well, you'd be surprised. I think psychiatrists and criminal psychologists who deal with violent offenders all the time
Yeah,
will tell you that that's not as uncommon as you would think.
sure.
That people do actually look for help, and maybe at times in their life have been crying out for help. They
Yes,
just don't receive it because our services are stretched to breaking point and beyond, and they've
yes,
been able to get it. But there will be a small cohort who say, "I'm not interested in that." But you are presuming we have the intelligence that says we think they are going to cause serious harm. Well, that's when
yeah,
we get to a proactive, what we call in counterterrorism, a pursue policy, where we are using covert methods to keep them under observation until we can
right.
arrest them for a
Okay,
substantive
so
offence.
there is one potential route that might have made a difference if the threat had been identified and Axel Rudakubana had agreed to the kind of help you're describing, because otherwise your options barely exist. Listening to you, do they, Neil? We've discussed surveillance. That it can't be practically done, least of all if you were to widen the definition of terrorism. I know that's been ruled out. And then you come to the question of involuntary detention. I mean, sectioning someone under the powers of the Mental Health Act or whatever it happens to be. And that is a very difficult threshold to pass.
It is. Well, the threshold that's set for criminal insanity is an incredibly high bar because, of course,
Yes,
we don't want people going into secure hospitals who are bad rather than insane. So, we want them to serve their term and justice to be seen to be done, not go into a hospital unless they fully deserve it. That threshold test is obviously only met after someone has been assessed for a huge period of time. So
yes,
I'd be interested to know, because don't forget, this particular individual did engage and did go through some assessments and
mm,
fully engage with child adolescent mental health services at one point. The fact that he withdrew, and this is the thing, we're giving listeners the idea that there is a magic bullet to stop violent offenders, and we will never make it 100% safe. We
no,
should never stop trying to get closer to that.
yes,
The reality is there's no 100% fail-safe. People lie, they dissemble, they come in and out of these programs, and eventually they may turn to, pursue the dark path to a violent crime. It doesn't mean that they didn't start off with the right intention, lose that intention. It doesn't mean that they've managed to fool professionals. It takes a very long time to assess somebody under strict conditions about whether they're a threat or not. And that is very difficult to do under anything other than a section order where they are permanently being looked at by psychiatric professionals.
Right. So more might have been done. Bottom line, more might have been done, but there's no reason to think that would have made it, well, anything like likely. These awful crimes could have been stopped.
My point is, you cannot guarantee that would have happened. He may still have done what he did. The only thing that would have stopped it is if the whole system identified that he was mobilizing towards a serious crime and there was an offence that he could have been arrested, charged with, and put behind bars, or he had been assessed as being so dangerous or so ill that he would have been sectioned in a secure hospital. Those are the two things that would have protected the public.
Indeed. And just lastly, the idea, which has been ruled out, of widening the definition of extremism and terrorism, which seems to have been immediately binned by ministers. It was right to bin those ideas. They weren't practical and they would have posed, arguably, a threat to freedom of speech.
Well, I don't like commenting on leaked reports, which we don't know the full conclusions of that report. I've not seen it. I heard Danny Shaw say this morning, I respect him greatly as a journalist. He will have had insight because of what he did advising the government. There are 38 recommendations, some of which would be sensible. But the Home Secretary was right to rule this one out. If you widen extremism so wide that it encompasses legitimate discourse, legitimate political speech, just because you find it offensive, that's the end of free speech. And it will encompass far too many people and organizations for any one organization to safely look at and distract our professionals from looking at people who are going to cause serious harm. It's like the boy who cried wolf. You know, we can't start looking for people and thinking that is extremism when it's not, when there are plenty of very extreme people about. The real gap, which I hope this report has addressed, is what do you do with people like the Southport monster, who had what we describe as mixed, unclear, and unstable ideology. In other words, he's looked at every ideology, trying to, I think, excuse what he wants to do, which is commit an insanely violent act. What do you do with that gap? I mean, do you widen? And this was the thing about widening the terrorism definition, which may have been dismissed. I don't think it's terrorism, but you are going to need something like a parallel process, which looks very like how we deal with countering terrorism, for countering these very, very violent individuals who have no cause.